Morning, everyone. Welcome to Chatham Community Church. My name is Jaime. I'm one of the pastors here, and I'm glad to see y'all here this morning. If you happen to be a guest, whether it's your first time with us or whether it's been a while, glad you're here. I'd love to say hi to you at the end of the service. I'm going to be just outside the doors on your way out, so come say hi. I'd love to hear your name, maybe a little bit about how you found us or how you ended up in Chatham County and what your experience was like this morning. And for those of you who are relatively new to our community, every once in a while, we have a gathering called Starting Point after each service. It's an opportunity to meet other people who are relatively new to our community, as well as some people who've been with us for a while, to hear a little bit about our history and what we're about here in Chatham County and what we're like as a church. So as you're considering whether or not this is a community where you want to settle in for the long term, Starting Point's a great place to hear more information, ask more questions, and meet more people to figure out if this is the right place for you. We're going to have a Starting Point gathering next week after each service. You don't have to RSVP, just show up and join us at the end of the service. Like I said, it's after each service, and we have 2 services, so I promise you it won't be long because we have to start the next service. So come and, 10, 15 minutes, you'll be able to meet a few people, hear a little bit more about us, ask any questions you have, and hopefully get some information that'll help you know whether this is the place where God's inviting you to settle for a longer stretch of time. So join us next week. The movie Catch Me If You Can is a semi-biographical movie that tells the story of Frank Abagnale Jr., who between his late teens and early 20s performed successful cons to the tune of millions of dollars by taking on different identities and professions, including professor, doctor, lawyer, and the one he uses the most, pilot. Throughout the years, he manages to evade the authorities a number of times, but he ends up captured by the FBI and he goes to prison. Though you watch him embody these professions and the identities he assumes in each profession convincingly enough that he tricks people who honestly ought to know better, you never get the sense throughout the movie that you actually see the real Frank, that you actually get to know who the real Frank is. And it's hard to tell whether he knows who he really is, whether he knows who Frank truly is. Perhaps not knowing that, or maybe having a sense of who he is and not being satisfied with that is what propels him to assume all these other identities, to take on all these other lives for as long as he's able to. The sad part is for all those years that he's doing that, he's actually missing out on the life he was made to live. He's missing out on the life that he had before him, on the life that was for himself. It's difficult. It's difficult to live the life you were made for if you don't know who you are, or if you aren't willing to accept who you were made to be. To kick off our fall season, we are talking about what it means to ignite the good life. What we've been saying and what we'll continue to say is that God made you and I to live a good life. And that good life, how we define that good life, might be different than definitions you've heard in other places. It might be different than what you hear in the media or in other sources for what it means to live a good life. But it is a good life nonetheless, and you and I were made for that kind of life. It's a life of flourishing, a life where we are connected to God. And in that connection, or through that connection, we are able to receive blessing and bless the world around us. When we live in a way that lines up with God's truth, God's purposes for us, or God's purpose for us, God's promises to us, and our God-given identity. It ignites seasons of flourishing, seasons of blessing, seasons of well-being. It's like lighting a match into a life that is both deeply satisfying and that produces good in us, through us, and for those around us. Here's the invitation that we've been making every week. It's the overall invitation of this fall season. We've been making this case every week. We'll continue to make it in different ways, specific ways. But here's the overall invitation. Align your life with God's good will and purpose for you, and you will ignite the good life. And not just the general good life, not just sort of a random generic good life, but actually the good life that you were made for. The good life God dreamed of for you when He formed you, when He made you. It comes when you align your life with God's good will and purpose. What we'll see in today's passage is that a key part in aligning our lives to all that is knowing who we are. And while there are many things that we could use or say to answer the question, who am I? Many things that we could put in the space, in that open space, in that name tag image. And many sources that may vie for our attention, that may vie for authority to tell us what we should put in that space. Part of what the Scriptures teach us is that there is something that should go in that line first and foremost. Something that is a foundational aspect of who we are, of our identity. Something upon which we can build any other sort of sense of identity and worth. Something that gives us or cements an intrinsic sense of value and worth that is secure, that is stable, that is unchanging and unyielding. Something that says something definitive about who we are. And what the passage Hillary read for us says that starts with looking to God, not to ourselves, for our sense of identity. And what the passage today tells us is that what God says is that we are His children. That the primary source for how we understand ourselves, for how we answer the question of who we are, for how we build our sense of identity is this: that God says that we are His children, that we are His daughters, that we are His sons. That actually, when we look to the one who made us to answer the question who we are ignited into the good life we were made for. And any other sort of names or labels or tags or sources of identity that we tack on find their proper place when they're put in their right perspective by that one, by being a child of God. Friends, we are able to step into the good life we were made for when we live out what it means to be children of God. We ignite the good life when we live in light of our identity as children of God. The passage that Hillary read for us talks about being children of God, and it talks about some of its implications. This is not the only place that talks about how we are part of the family of God, how we are His children. It's not the only place that talks about its implications. So while this is not exhaustive, it is informative and helpful. So what I want to do is make a few observations from the text, and then I'm going to invite us to reflect and take some steps for application. Here's how the passage starts. The first thing the passage does is build sort of a sense of anticipation, a sense of awe, a sense of wonder. Note the words that John uses. There is something seemingly awe-inspiring in his mind about being called children of God. He draws people's attention to us. Look at the adjectives that he uses. Look at the fact that he circles back to it. He wants to make sure that his audience sticks with this, that his audience notices, right? He says, you're children of God, and then he says, and that is what we are, right? He emphasizes it. It's like he's putting it in bold or underlined before Microsoft Word existed. He's keen on his original audience, and by extension, all who've read or heard these words in future years, even to us today. He's keen on all of us knowing that in Christ, we've been given a new identity, and a foundational identity at that. This is a paradigm-breaking concept for a first-century audience. The idea that people would be children of God, that they would be part of the family of God, would have been a paradigm-breaking concept. It was not the way most people, even most adherents of religions, whatever religion might have been in that region at that time, would have thought of themselves. It is not how they would have conceived of their relationship with their God. The nature of the relationship between adherents of other religions, devotees, and their God was far more transactional than it was relational. There was a relational aspect to it, but it was primarily transactional. You did things to curry the God's favor or to assuage the God's wrath. And when you did things to curry the God's favor, the understanding was that the God owed you, or that the God would do something for you. It was far more transactional than relational. But through Jesus, what God has done is He cemented a familial dynamic in the relationship between his followers and their God, between the Creator and his creation. And here's the thing, that familial bond, that relational dynamic is born entirely out of God's love for us. It's born entirely out of God's love for us. And it's not just God's love, it is God's abundant love. It is God's great love. Note the words that John uses. And it is not just a love that is demonstrated, it is a love that is lavished. The words are important. John is trying to communicate how significant this is to his audience and to us. Friends, our identity as children of God is not one we can earn or have to earn. It comes entirely from God's abundant love. And it's a love that he gives generously. The idea that we are children of God is not something that we achieve. It is not something that we earn. It is not something that we work for or work towards. It is something that God, out of God's self, out of his great love, out of his abundant love, has lavished, has poured out, has bestowed, has granted an ongoing outpouring for all who would receive it. God's love does not run out. And God does not hoard his love. He doesn't wait around for us to get it right before he demonstrates it to us or before he shows the magnitude of his love for us. He doesn't wait for us to meet a bar or to hit a mark to tell us that he loves us or to show us that he loves us or to allow the effects of his love to fall upon us. To rescue humanity, to rescue our world out of God's love, God sends Jesus. And through Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, he makes it so that we can become part of the family of God, so that we can become welcomed into the family of God. And this was not just for those in the first century. Jesus did not just live, die, and rise for the people that saw him or the people that would hear about him in that first century. He did that for you and I as well. Jesus made it so that you and I could be called children of God. And he did that before any of us had taken a breath. You had done nothing to earn God's love before God demonstrated his love. You had done nothing to merit being called a child of the Most High God before God declared and did the work that you would be called that you would be welcomed into that. God did it all out of God's own love, out of God's self. It is not something that we earn. It is something that is bestowed. God takes the initiative. Before we are asking the question, who am I? Before we are trying to construct our sense of identity, God has done the work that we would be able to receive the solid foundation on which to build our understanding of who we are. God has gone first to answer the question so that we could build, so that we could ignite the life that we were made to live. Folks, that's significant. That's huge. That's awe-inspiring. As the passage goes on, the sense that we get is that it is so significant, it is of a magnitude so large that we can't fully grasp it in all of its fullness. And for some, it's actually impossible to grasp or very difficult to grasp. Note what John says in the next section. The world does not know us because it did not know him. And then he says, and what we will be has not yet been made known. He said we're children of God, and he's saying some people can't understand that. And even we who are talking, even John who's writing about how awesome this is, how much this is born out of God's great love, how significant it is, he's saying we can't fully grasp this. That is how impressive this is. That is how great a demonstration of God's love is. He has bestowed upon us something that our minds cannot fully grasp yet. One of the key turning points in my life was the process through which I forgave my father. It was a part of sort of the early days of me seeking Jesus and becoming a Christian, folks who knew me, folks who loved me, folks who were concerned for my well-being, saw the pain, saw the hurt, saw the bitterness that were there, and encouraged me to enter into a process of forgiveness. I was helped to understand that one of the things that would both free me and would help me live the life I was made to live was to let go, was to forgive, was to sort of release this sense of wanting to right how I'd been wronged against my dad. Now, the process is a story for another day. But what I want to focus on is that when I first took that step to declare that I was forgiving my dad and entering into a process in which I would let go, release the indebtedness, release the pain I felt, release the anger I felt, release sort of the righteous indignation and the wanting to sort of exact a toll on my dad. When I took that first step, I shared that with some of my family members, and it did not compute for them. It did not compute because they knew the pain. They knew the tears. They knew the disappointment. They knew the betrayal. And when they heard me say those words, it was like something sort of broke. They were angry at me. They were betrayed. They were incredulous. Even as I tried to explain that this was an outcome of this new identity that I had, of this walk I was engaging in following God, of this freedom I was experiencing, even as I was able to share at my young age some of the good fruit that I was seeing out of this process already, even as I shared that I wasn't saying that these things that that my father did were okay, or that I was pretending that they didn't happen, they could not compute. It did not make sense. Part of that is because they were not following God. Friends, our identity as children of God is at odds with the prevailing worldview and senses of identity in our world. And part of what that does is it makes it difficult for folks who aren't following Jesus to understand the implications, the outworking of being children of God. For some people, it's going to be impossible. We are going to do things, we are going to behave in ways, we are going to make choices that are not going to compute for people. Sometimes it will be benign confusion. Sometimes they'll just write us off as maybe a little bit wacky or weird. Sometimes they will get angry because we are not aligning with how they are living. Living faithfully into being children of God, being ignited into the good life is going to puzzle some people. When that happens, one, don't be surprised. Second, actually examine whether this is a fruit of you living into being a child of God and not just you being annoying or obnoxious or obtuse. Examine that. But then, if it's clear to you that, yes, this is a fruit of you living into a child of God and the person doesn't understand, don't be surprised, but then don't back away. Don't back away. Because what's at hand is possibly an opportunity to invite them to explore what it might mean for them. For them to wrestle with who God made them to be. Maybe there's an invitation to invite them to consider receiving their identity as being children of God and having them be ignited into the life they were made to live. The invitation often in those situations is not to try to explain to them why you're doing these things or how this is working out in your life, but simply to invite them to come and see what the God who made them, the God who loves them, the God who calls them or wants them to receive their identity as his children, what he can do, what he can give, what he can grant. The marvelous thing is I've been at this for, over 20 years now. Over 20 years of being a child of God. And even after all these years, I still don't have my mind wrapped around all that it entails. I'm still discovering layers of how significant this is, of what this does to my soul, of how this changes my life. It's something that we can only comprehend as we are experiencing it. Every day, there's a new facet to it. Every day. I'm not saying we're going to realize that new facet every day, but every day, every season, more is being revealed. In fact, we won't grasp it fully this side of heaven. That is how significant. That is how powerful. That is how all-encompassing this is. Our passage for today closes with something for us to do. Verse 3 says, all who have this hope in him purify themselves just as he is pure. It calls us to purify ourselves. The call to purify ourselves is basically a call to align ourselves, to align our thoughts, to align our behaviors, to align our words, to align our actions, to align our habits with God's will. With God's will. And further distance ourselves from all the ways we've been misaligned with God's will, with God's truth, with God's purpose, with God's promise. Friends, aligning our lives fully to God's will, purpose, and promises is a high bar. It's a high bar. I miss it every day. Maybe you do as well. It's a lifelong process. But I want you to note how the call for that alignment is framed in this passage. It's a call to alignment for those who have their hope in Jesus. What it is saying is that it's in light of the hope that we purify ourselves. It's in light of the hope that we have, that what Jesus said, that what John is framing in this passage, that what God has done is true, that God's promises are effective, that God's truth is worth following, that God's purpose is worth adopting, that our identity as children of God is worth living into. That hope that we have, that these things that God is saying are going to come to pass and are coming to pass, it's in light of our faith that what Jesus did on the cross is sufficient and effective to grant us life everlasting. That it's in light of that we then move to align ourselves. It's not in order to earn those things, but is out of having those things bestowed upon us. Lots of us have experienced the heavy burden of a religion that leads with behavior modification and conformity. Lots of us have experienced that in churches that have called us to be a particular way or do a particular thing in order for us to be accepted. But in the good life God made us for, the call to behave always follows the invitation to believe that we belong. The first step in the family of God is to believe that God has called you his child. That the work that Jesus has done on the cross and through his resurrection is enough to form your identity and ignite you into the good life. And then it is out of that, that we begin to learn how to behave as his children. We behave like God calls his children to, not in order to earn the right to be called his children, but to live out that identity that's been granted to all of us in all of its fullness. Maybe some of us here have felt kept from the good life, kept from the life God has for us, from entering the family of God because we've messed up too much, or because we mess up too frequently. We just can't seem to string together 3 days where we don't mess up, where we don't misbehave, where we don't have thoughts that are just not good, or say things that we really shouldn't have. Now, I'm not going to tell you that there aren't any changes involved in following Jesus, that there aren't any changes involved in living into being a child of God. There are. But those aren't things to take care of before you become a child of God. There are things to take care of in the freedom, in the safety, in the security of the foundational element of our identity. That God has done out of his great love the work to call us his children. They are part of how you live life as a child of God. When you believe that God has welcomed you into his family through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. In the first century, there were a number of identity markers that people carried. They were names or labels that people had placed on them, that they earned or that they took on. And many of them said something about their standing in society, their standing in comparison to others, their standing in religion, their worth and their value as a human being. There were labels like Roman, there were labels like Jew, there were labels like Pharisee, there were labels like centurion, there were labels like poor, there were labels like rich, there were labels like slave, free, man or woman. All of those carried implications for someone's sense of worth and their standing in society. For some, either earning or having those labels bestowed upon them granted them a good hand in life. For many, it was not such a good hand. Some felt valuable and powerful. Some of them felt the opposite. The problem was none of them was stable and reliable enough on which to build one's primary source of identity. All of them were subject. All of them were shaky. All of them could change in one way or another. In one way or another. In one way or another, they could all fail because they were all tied to what's become known as the three core identity lies. I am what I do, I am what others think of me, and I am what I have or what I control. These are the three things that people misbelieve that lead them to put labels on themselves as primary things that are shaky. I'll give you an example. The Pharisees believed that they were valuable based on what they did, on how much they knew about the law and how much they practiced the law well. And yet, part of what they did is they made it harder for others to have their own sense of value and worth. Because all they did was play the comparison game, and all they had to do all the time was try to hit the bar and hit the bar and hit the bar. That is a shaky life to live. The Jewish authorities, at least in Jerusalem, had their status because they maintained a good relationship with Rome, with the empire in Jerusalem. As long as they stayed in their good graces, they were allowed to stay in power. They were seen as important. And yet, just a few decades after Jesus dies and rises, the temple is destroyed and the whole religious authority structure is crumbled. They no longer are in the good graces of the Romans. They no longer have their sense of value, their sense of worth. The Romans themselves were important and valuable because of their military conquest. And yet it has been millennia since there was a Roman Empire. That label as a primary identity no longer carries the weight that it did in the first century because they were built on these lies. Now, friends, it's not that there's no room in life to consider those things. There's nothing wrong with having been a person who studied Scripture and wanted to follow the law. There's nothing wrong with being a Jew who wanted to have a good relationship with the government. There's nothing wrong with being of a particular nationality. There's nothing wrong with any of those identities, but they can't be the primary way people understand themselves because they are shaky and they're fleeting. What the Father has done in giving us the identity as children of God is giving something that gives us inherent worth and dignity that is permanent. That is permanent, that is lasting, and that is independent of what we do, independent of what others think we are, and independent of what we accumulate or have. That frees us. That freed in the first century these people and all types of people to form a different kind of community. It's a community that has gone on to change the world because the primary thing that united them was unchanging, was non-competitive, and it was unearned. Friends, the labels we use today, the names that we carry might be different, but when we make them our primary source of identity, they all succumb to one of the identity lies. When we build our lives on shaky foundation, we spend our lives trying to shore up that foundation instead of living the good life we were made for. Instead of living the good life we were made for. Think of the things you could put in that name tag. Again, lots of them are good. None of them are good enough to be primary unless it's child of God. I want to invite you to consider the ways that you label yourself, the things on which you build your sense of self. Is there a chance that any of them are occupying a more important space than they ought? Is there a chance that any of them have become primary? Here's a good sign to check. Think of what would happen if you lost that. Would you feel like your world crumbled? You know, there are some people that build their sense of identity on their job, and then they are lost in retirement. They build their sense of identity on being providers, and then their world crumbles when they get laid off. Now, I'm not saying being laid off is not a crisis. It is. But it's not the kind of crisis that should threaten your sense of self, your sense of worth, your sense of dignity. There are people whose whole identity is built on being a particular type of parent. And when their child doesn't turn out the way that they need to, or when their child tries to become an adult, they try to hold on too long because they have nothing else on which to hang their sense of value and worth. Again, nothing wrong with being a parent. Nothing wrong with being a good parent. Nothing wrong with striving to raise good children. Not a secure enough foundation on which to build your sense of self and worth and dignity and value. Our identity in Christ counters all three identity lies. We have already been granted being children of God. We don't earn it. The Father's love has already established what he thinks of us. It is unchanging. And he's already given and promised to give all that we need. We don't have to concern ourselves with how much we accumulate or how much we control. This is a freeing concept because we don't have to worry then about who we are and what our value is based on what we earn, what people think of us, or what we have or control. All of that has already been decided, has already been established by the cross of Christ. Here's what I'd love for you to do now. I'd love for you to put your hands out. I'd love for you to close your eyes if you want to. I'd love for you to imagine that name tag in your hands. And on it is written an identity marker, a label, a name that is taking up too much space in your life. You may have built your sense of identity and worth and value on it. You may be trying to. It may be encroaching. See those words written on that page, on that name tag. In a moment, I'm going to invite you to turn over your hands. Not yet. Because when you turn over your hands, what I'm asking you to do is to tell God that you are surrendering, not that label, but the power you've given that label to shape your sense of worth or value or identity in a primary way. When you're ready, turn your hands over and say that to God. Say, God, I'm giving up this being a primary source of my identity, my sense of value, my sense of worth. When you're ready, turn over your hands. After you've done that, I want to invite you to hold your hands up again. Imagine a fresh name tag. Nothing on it. And I want you to imagine that God writes on it, "You are my child." And then as you're holding your hands up there, pray to God in whatever way you can. And as you're ready, say, God, I receive this. I build my life on this. Let the Spirit, God's Spirit, imbue you with that sense of firm, unchanging, unyielding, strong sense of value, dignity, and worth that is born out of God's love, not out of your efforts, not out of anything else. Receive it. Receive it. Friends, if you've done that for the first time today, I'd love for you to come talk to me at the end of the service. If this is the first day that you've received a sense of being a child of God, I'd love for you to talk to me at the end of the service. There are some next steps I'd like to talk with you about. Let me pray for us. Jesus, thank you. Thank you that you have made the way for us to be your children. You have made the way. We didn't, we can't, we aren't expected to. Lord, may we receive all the goodness that comes from being rooted and grounded in a sense of value, a sense of dignity, a sense of worth that is born out of your immense love that you generously and abundantly grant to each one of us. In your name, amen.